The day I became the most hated man in Lakeside Estates was the day I became its most powerful. It started with a $75 fine for fishing alone at my own cabin and ended with me owning the lake that the entire HOA thought belonged to them. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you about Margaret Whitfield, the HOA president who made the mistake of thinking she could bully a quiet man into submission. She slapped me with a fine for creating a hazardous situation by engaging in solo water activities without proper supervision, as if I needed a babysitter to cast a line from my own dock. What she didn't know was that I've been quietly gathering ammunition for years, waiting for the perfect moment to remind everyone in this pretentious neighborhood exactly who owned what. By the time I was done with Margaret and her precious HOA, she'd lost her position, her reputation, and her smug little smile. But the real kicker? The lake she'd been micromanaging for 5 years wasn't community property at all. It was mine, every single drop of it. Before I tell you how I brought down the most power-hungry HOA president in county history, I need to know something from you in the comments. Have you ever dealt with an HOA Karen who pushed you too far? What would you do if someone fined you for fishing at your own property? Because trust me, after you hear this story, you'll understand why sometimes the quiet ones are the most dangerous. My name is David Chun, and I'm a land surveyor by trade. For 32 years, I've made my living measuring property lines, researching deeds, and understanding the intricate legal web that determines who owns what in this world. It's precise work that requires patience, attention to detail, and the ability to dig through decades of municipal records to find the truth. Most people find it boring. I find it fascinating, especially when that knowledge becomes a weapon. I inherited my cabin at Lakeside Estates from my father in 2019. He'd owned it since 1987, back when the neighborhood was just a collection of summer cottages around a pristine 40-acre lake in northern Michigan. Dad was a simple man who loved to fish, and he passed that love on to me. Some of my earliest memories are of sitting on that dock with him, watching the sunrise paint the water gold while we waited for the bass to bite. The cabin itself wasn't much to look at, a modest 2-bedroom structure with cedar siding and a wraparound porch that faced the water. But it sat on 3 acres of prime lakefront property, with nearly 200 feet of shoreline and a dock that my father had built with his own hands. To me, it was paradise. To the HOA, it was apparently a problem. When Dad passed away, I was dealing with my own struggles. My wife, Sarah, had been battling cancer for 2 years, and between her medical bills and my own grief, I barely had the energy to maintain the property. The cabin sat mostly empty for the first year after Dad's death, visited only occasionally when Sarah felt well enough to make the 3-hour drive from our home in Grand Rapids. That's when the HOA notices started arriving. At first, they were minor infractions. The grass was too long. The dock needed power washing. The shoreline had excessive natural debris, which was just a fancy way of saying I hadn't raked the leaves that had fallen into the shallow water. Each notice came with a fine, usually $25 to $50, and a condescending letter about maintaining community standards. I paid them without complaint. Sarah was getting sicker, and I had bigger problems than fighting with a neighborhood association over trivial maintenance issues. The money wasn't the issue, it was the principle. But I wasn't ready for that fight yet. Sarah passed away in the spring of 2021. The funeral was small, family only, and afterward, I found myself driving to the cabin more often. It was the only place where I could still feel close to both her and my father. I'd sit on that dock for hours, sometimes fishing, sometimes just staring at the water and trying to make sense of a world that had taken away the 2 people I loved most. The HOA seemed to sense my vulnerability. The fines increased in frequency and severity. They cited me for excessive morning decorations when I hung a simple wind chime that Sarah had loved. They fined me for unauthorized lakefront modifications when I replaced a few rotting boards on the dock my father had built. Every time I turned around, there was another notice in my mailbox, another demand for payment, another reminder that I was apparently failing to meet their standards. But I kept paying. I kept my head down and tried to grieve in peace. I thought if I just complied with their demands, they'd eventually leave me alone. I was wrong. Margaret Whitfield became HOA president in early 2022, and everything changed. Where her predecessor had been content with minor harassment, Margaret had bigger ambitions. She was a retired real estate agent with too much time on her hands and a desperate need to control everything around her. She'd moved to Lakeside Estates 5 years earlier with her husband Gerald, purchasing one of the newer McMansions that had been built on the far side of the lake. The first time I met Margaret in person, she was standing on my dock without permission, taking pictures with her phone. I'd driven up to the cabin early on a Saturday morning, looking forward to a peaceful day of fishing, when I found her there in her pristine white tennis outfit, documenting what she called safety violations. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice level. "This is private property." She turned around with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Margaret was in her early 60s, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of aggressive confidence that comes from never being told no. "Mr. Chun, I'm Margaret Whitfield, your HOA president. I'm conducting a routine safety inspection of all waterfront structures." I walked past her onto my own dock, setting down my tackle box and fishing rod. I didn't give permission for any inspection. Her smile grew colder. "According to our community guidelines, all structures that interface with community water features are subject to periodic review. I've already identified several concerning issues." "Community water features?" I repeated, not bothering to hide my irritation. "This is a private lake." Margaret's laugh was sharp and dismissive. "Oh, Mr. Chun, I can see you haven't familiarized yourself with our community regulations. The lake is a shared amenity for all residents of Lakeside Estates. Your dock extends into community waters, which makes it subject to our oversight." She gestured toward the water with her phone, still recording. "I've already noted several violations. The dock has loose boards, the support posts show signs of rot, and you're missing proper safety equipment. That's going to be a $300 fine for each violation." I felt my jaw clench. $900 for a dock my father had built with his own hands, a dock that had been standing safely for over 30 years. "I'd like to see the documentation that proves this lake is community property." Margaret's smile turned condescending. "Mr. Chun, you've been living in this community for years. Surely you understand how HOAs work. The lake is maintained by our association fees, which means it's managed by the association. I don't need to provide you with legal documentation when you're clearly in violation of established community standards." She started walking toward the shore, still taking pictures. "I'll be submitting my report to the board this afternoon. You'll receive formal notice of the violations and fines within 48 hours. I suggest you contact a licensed contractor to address these safety issues immediately." I watched her walk away, my hands shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief. That dock had been my father's pride and joy. He'd spent weeks that summer in 1987 setting the posts, measuring every board, ensuring it would last for decades. And now some busybody with a real estate license was calling it unsafe. But what bothered me more was her casual claim that the lake was community property. In all my years as a surveyor, I'd never seen a private lake that was somehow managed by an HOA while still being owned by individual property holders. Something didn't add up. That night, I called my neighbor Tom Harrison, one of the original residents who'd been there since the early days. Tom was pushing 80 and had watched the neighborhood evolve from a quiet fishing community to whatever it was becoming under Margaret's leadership. "Dave, I'm sorry to hear about your troubles with Margaret," Tom said when I told him about the dock inspection. "She's been making life difficult for a lot of folks lately. But I have to tell you, she's not wrong about the lake being community property. At least, that's what everyone's been told." "What do you mean, told?" Tom was quiet for a moment. "Well, it's not like anyone's ever seen the actual paperwork. When the HOA was formed back in the 90s, they just said the lake was part of the community assets. Margaret's been very clear about that since she took over. But who actually owns it? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I always assumed it was some kind of shared ownership arrangement. Maybe you should ask to see the deed." After hanging up with Tom, I sat on my cabin's porch and stared out at the lake. The water was calm, reflecting the stars like a mirror. This was where I'd scattered some of Sarah's ashes, where I'd said goodbye to my father, where I came to find peace in a world that seemed determined to take it away from me. Margaret Whitfield could find me for anything she wanted. She could make my life miserable with her petty power games. But she made one crucial mistake. She'd pissed off a man who knew how to read a deed. The next morning, I received the official violation notice in my mailbox. The fines totaled exactly $900, just as Margaret had promised. But there was more. The notice also included a new rule that had apparently been passed by the board the previous evening. Solo water activities, including fishing, boating, or swimming, are prohibited for safety reasons. All water activities must be supervised by a certified lifeguard or approved community member. I read that line 3 times, feeling my blood pressure rise with each reading. They were trying to stop me from fishing alone at my own cabin. The one activity that brought me peace, the one connection I still had to my father and my wife, was now against the rules. That's when I decided to do something I probably should have done years earlier. I was going to research the property ownership of lakeside estates, starting with the lake itself. And Margaret Whitfield was about to learn that sometimes the quiet guy with the boring job is the most dangerous person in the room. I spent the next week at the county courthouse, digging through property records, tax assessments, and historical deeds. What I found was fascinating, infuriating, and ultimately exactly what I needed to destroy Margaret's little empire. The lake at Lakeside Estates wasn't community property at all. It had never been community property. In fact, according to the original property survey from 1923, the lake was owned by whoever held the deed to the property that surrounded it. And thanks to some interesting boundary changes over the decades, that property was now mine. The original tract had been purchased by a logging company in the 1920s. When they cleared the land around the lake in the 1930s, they sold off individual lots to private buyers while retaining ownership of the water rights. In 1954, the logging company sold those water rights to the owner of the largest parcel, the 3-acre lot where my cabin now stood. My father had purchased that lot in 1987, which meant he'd also purchased the water rights. When he died and left the property to me, I'd inherited not just the cabin and the land, but the entire lake. Every single drop of water that Margaret had been regulating, every dock fee she'd been collecting, every fine she'd been issuing for community water violations, it was all based on a lie. The HOA had been formed in 1994, 7 years after my father bought the property. When they created their community guidelines, they'd simply assumed the lake was community property without bothering to check the actual ownership records. For 28 years, they'd been governing a lake they didn't own, collecting fees they had no right to collect, and imposing rules they had no authority to enforce. But here's the truly beautiful part. Margaret hadn't just been wrong about the lake ownership. She'd been actively trespassing on my property every time she conducted her safety inspections. She'd been collecting dock fees from other homeowners for the privilege of accessing water that belonged to me. And she'd been issuing fines based on rules that had no legal foundation whatsoever. I had 3 options. I could quietly approach Margaret and explain the situation, hoping she'd back down gracefully. I could hire a lawyer and fight this through the proper legal channels. Or I could do what any reasonable person would do after being harassed for years by a power-hungry HOA president. I could make her life as miserable as she'd made mine. Guess which option I chose? First, I needed allies. Tom Harrison was the obvious choice. He'd been dealing with Margaret's nonsense longer than anyone and had the respect of the older residents. When I showed him the property records, his reaction was everything I'd hoped for. "You're telling me that Margaret has been charging us dock fees for the privilege of using your lake?" Tom's voice was rising with each word. "For 5 years, she's been collecting $200 annually from every waterfront property owner, claiming it was for lake maintenance." "That's exactly what I'm telling you," I said, spreading the deed copies across his kitchen table. "According to these records, I own the lake, the water rights, and technically, I have the authority to restrict access to anyone I choose." Tom stared at the documents, shaking his head. "Dave, this is bigger than just your dock fines. There are 43 waterfront properties in this community. If Margaret's been collecting dock fees from all of them, that's over $8,000 per year," I finished. For 5 years. What are you going to do? I smiled, and for the first time in months, it felt genuine. I'm going to give Margaret exactly what she's been asking for. If she wants to regulate lake activities, she's going to have to do it with my permission. And something tells me she's not going to like my terms. The next phase of my plan required careful timing. I needed to document everything Margaret had been doing, build a paper trail of her harassment, and most importantly, I needed to make sure that when I revealed the truth about the lake ownership, it would have maximum impact. I started by formally requesting copies of all HOA financial records related to lake management. As a property owner, I had the right to review these documents, and Margaret couldn't refuse without raising suspicions. When the record arrived, they were even more damning than I'd expected. Not only had Margaret been collecting dock fees from waterfront property owners, but she'd also been charging the HOA's general fund for lake maintenance that consisted mainly of her own inspection visits and occasional treatments by a water management company that happened to be owned by her nephew. The conflict of interest was so blatant, it was almost comical. I also discovered that Margaret had been issuing fines for lake violations at an unprecedented rate since becoming president. In 2021, the year before she took office, the HOA had issued a total of 12 lake-related fines. In 2022, Margaret's first year as president, that number had jumped to 87. She'd turned the lake into a personal revenue stream, using increasingly ridiculous violations to justify her authority. While I was building my case, Margaret was escalating her harassment. The $75 fine for fishing alone was followed by additional penalties for unauthorized early morning activities and excessive noise during quiet hours. Apparently, the sound of my tackle box opening before 8 a.m. was disturbing the peace. She also started showing up at the cabin unannounced, always with her phone recording, always with some new violation to document. She cited me for having non-regulation fishing equipment when she saw my father's vintage tackle box. She fined me for improper bait storage when she found my cooler on the dock. She even tried to fine me for unauthorized fish harvesting when she saw me cleaning a bass I'd caught. Each fine came with that same condescending smile, that same smug certainty that she was untouchable. Margaret had mistaken my previous compliance for weakness, and now she was pushing harder, testing to see how far she could go before I broke. What she didn't realize was that I wasn't breaking. I was preparing. The breaking point came on a Saturday morning in late July. I'd driven up to the cabin early, hoping to get some fishing in before the summer heat made it unbearable. The lake was perfectly still, the kind of glassy surface that promised good fishing, and for the first time in weeks, I felt genuinely peaceful. I was sitting on my dock, coffee in one hand and fishing rod in the other, when I heard the sound of a boat motor. Margaret was approaching in her husband's pontoon boat, accompanied by 2 other HOA board members and what appeared to be a representative from the county sheriff's office. They pulled up to my dock, and Margaret stepped off the boat with all the authority of someone who believed she owned the place. "Mr. Chun, we need to discuss your continued violations of community water safety regulations." The sheriff's deputy, a young man who looked uncomfortable with the situation, stepped forward. "Sir, I'm Deputy Williams. I understand there's been a dispute about dock safety and water usage." "There's no dispute," Margaret interjected before I could respond. "Mr. Chun has been repeatedly fined for safety violations and continues to engage in unauthorized solo water activities. He's also been hostile and uncooperative with HOA board members during official inspections." I set down my coffee and looked at the deputy. "Officer, has anyone filed a criminal complaint?" "No, sir. This is a civil matter. The HOA requested that we be present to document the situation and ensure everyone remains calm." Margaret's smile was triumphant. "Mr. Chun, the board has voted to suspend your water access privileges until all outstanding fines are paid and proper safety measures are implemented. We're also requiring that you submit to weekly dock inspections and that all fishing activities be supervised by an approved community member." She gestured to the other board members, who were nodding along like trained seals. "If you continue to violate these rules, we'll be forced to seek legal action to protect the safety of our community." I stood up slowly, feeling 30 years of professional calm settle over me like armor. Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer very carefully. Do you have documentation proving that the HOA owns this lake? Her smile faltered slightly. Mr. Chun, we've been over this. The lake is managed by the community association. That's not what I asked. I asked if you own it. The community owns it collectively through the HOA structure. Show me the deed. Margaret's composure cracked, just slightly. I don't need to show you anything. These are established community standards that have been in place for years. I reached into my tackle box and pulled out a folder I've been keeping there for exactly this moment. Well, Margaret, I have some documents I think you'll find interesting. Officer Williams, would you mind taking a look at these? I handed the deputy copies of the original property survey, the deed to my father's property, and the water rights documentation. His eyes widened as he read through the papers. Ma'am, he said to Margaret, these documents appear to show that Mr. Chen owns the lake and the water rights. Do you have any paperwork that contradicts this? Margaret's face went pale. That's impossible. The lake has been community property since the HOA was formed. Actually, I said, my voice perfectly calm, it's been my property since 1987, which means that for the past 5 years, you've been trespassing on my land, collecting fees you have no right to collect, and issuing fines based on rules you have no authority to enforce. The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret stared at the documents, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The other board members looked confused and terrified. Deputy Williams looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Furthermore, I continued, I've been documenting your harassment for months. I have records of every unlawful fine, every unauthorized inspection, every attempt to restrict my legal use of my own property. I've also discovered some interesting irregularities in the HOA's financial records regarding lake management fees. Margaret finally found her voice. This is ridiculous. You can't own a lake. That's not how it works. Actually, Margaret, it's exactly how it works. And now that we've established ownership, I have some new rules I'd like to implement. Effective immediately, all waterfront property owners will need to negotiate new access agreements with me personally. All dock fees previously collected by the HOA will need to be refunded, with interest. And anyone who wants to fish, boat, or swim in my lake will need my explicit permission. I turned to Deputy Williams. Officer, I'm formally requesting that these individuals leave my property immediately. They're trespassing. The deputy nodded, clearly relieved to have a straightforward legal issue to deal with. Ma'am, you'll need to move your boat and leave the premises. This is a civil property dispute, but if the owner is asking you to leave, you need to comply. Margaret's face was bright red now, her carefully maintained composure completely shattered. You can't do this. I'm the HOA president. I have authority here. Not on my property, you don't, I said, sitting back down and picking up my fishing rod. You have 60 seconds to get off my dock before I call the sheriff's office and report you for trespassing. They left, but Margaret's parting words echoed across the water. This isn't over, Mr. Chun. I'll see you in court. I smiled and cast my line into the water. For the first time in years, I was genuinely looking forward to what came next. That evening, I began implementing the most satisfying revenge plan of my life. I started by sending a formal letter to every waterfront property owner in Lakeside Estates, informing them of the true ownership of the lake and requesting that they cease all payments to the HOA for dock fees and water access. The letter was professional, detailed, and included copies of all relevant documentation. I also offered to negotiate individual access agreements with each property owner, with rates significantly lower than what the HOA had been charging. After all, these people were my neighbors, and most of them had been just as victimized by Margaret's power trip as I had. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 24 hours, I received calls from over 30 property owners, all expressing their outrage at Margaret's deception and their gratitude for my reasonable approach to the situation. Several offered to join me in any legal action against the HOA. Tom Harrison was particularly helpful in spreading the word. He'd been documenting Margaret's abuses for years and had contacts with several other longtime residents who were tired of her authoritarian approach. By the end of the week, we'd formed an informal coalition of property owners who were ready to support whatever action was necessary to remove Margaret from power. But the real fun began when I started enforcing my property rights. The first thing I did was install a series of private property signs around the lake perimeter. They were professional, weatherproof, and clearly marked with my name and contact information. The signs also included a notice that all water access was by permission only and that trespassers would be prosecuted. Margaret's response was predictable. She called the county code enforcement office, claiming the signs were an illegal attempt to restrict community access. When the inspector arrived, I showed him the same property records I'd shown Deputy Williams. The inspector not only confirmed my right to post the signs, but also suggested I might want to install more of them. Next, I had a professional surveyor, a colleague of mine, conduct a comprehensive property survey, clearly marking my boundaries and water rights. The survey confirmed what I already knew. I owned the lake, the water rights, and a significant portion of what the HOA had been calling community waterfront. The survey also revealed something interesting. Several of the newer docks, including the one belonging to Margaret's property, extended beyond the legal boundaries of their lots and into my water rights area. Technically, they were trespassing structures that I could demand be removed. But I wasn't done yet. I contacted the water management company that had been billing the HOA for lake maintenance, the one owned by Margaret's nephew. When I explained that I was the actual owner of the lake and that all future contracts would need to be approved by me, they were surprisingly cooperative. They also confirmed that Margaret had been approving expensive treatments that were unnecessary and had been billing the HOA at inflated rates. Armed with this information, I filed a formal complaint with the county attorney's office, alleging that Margaret had been misappropriating HOA funds and operating a fraudulent fee collection scheme. I also filed a civil lawsuit seeking damages for 5 years of harassment, unlawful fines, and emotional distress. The legal proceedings moved faster than I'd expected. Within 2 weeks, the county attorney's office had opened an investigation into the HOA's financial practices. A forensic accountant was assigned to review all records related to lake management, and Margaret was formally notified that she was under investigation for potential fraud. The HOA board called an emergency meeting to address the situation. Margaret, predictably, tried to paint me as a troublemaker who was using technicalities to disrupt a peaceful community. She claimed that even if I legally owned the lake, I had a moral obligation to honor the established community agreements. The meeting was held at the community center, and nearly every resident attended. Margaret stood at the front of the room, her usual confidence replaced by obvious desperation. She'd aged visibly in the past 2 weeks, her perfectly styled hair showing gray roots and her face drawn with stress. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "we're facing an unprecedented attack on our community values. Mr. Chun is using obscure legal technicalities to destroy the cooperative spirit that has made Lakeside Estates a wonderful place to live." She gestured toward me with barely concealed hostility. "He's demanding that we pay him personally for access to our own lake, access that we've enjoyed for decades. He's trying to hold our community hostage for his personal profit." When it was my turn to speak, I stood up slowly and walked to the front of the room. I could feel the tension in the air, the mixture of curiosity, anger, and anticipation for my neighbors. "I want to be very clear about something," I said, my voice carrying easily through the silent room. "I never wanted to be in this position. For 5 years, I've paid Margaret's fines without complaint. I've endured her harassment, her unauthorized inspections, and her increasingly ridiculous regulations. I've watched her turn a peaceful fishing lake into her personal kingdom, collecting fees she had no right to collect and imposing rules she had no authority to enforce." I pulled out a thick folder of documents. These are copies of every fine I've received since Margaret became president. $75 for fishing alone, $50 for early morning activities, $100 for excessive noise during quiet hours. Margaret has fined me over $2,000 for the crime of trying to grieve in peace on my own property. The room was completely silent now. I could see several residents nodding in recognition. They'd received similar fines for equally ridiculous violations. I also want to address Margaret's claim that I'm trying to profit from this situation. I've offered every waterfront property owner access agreements at rates significantly lower than what the HOA has been charging. I've also offered to refund the illegal fees that have been collected over the past 5 years. Does that sound like someone who's trying to hold the community hostage? I looked directly at Margaret, who was staring at me with unconcealed hatred. What I won't do is continue to be bullied by someone who thinks she can make up rules as she goes along. Margaret has been operating a fraudulent scheme for 5 years, collecting money she had no right to collect and imposing regulations she had no authority to enforce. That ends now. The vote to remove Margaret from the HOA board was unanimous. Even her closest allies abandoned her when faced with the evidence of her deception. She was also removed from all other HOA positions and banned from serving on any committees. But the real justice came 3 months later when the county attorney's office completed its investigation. Margaret was formally charged with fraud, theft of HOA funds, and operating a fraudulent fee collection scheme. The forensic accountant had discovered that over the 5 years of her presidency, she'd collected over $40,000 in illegal dock fees, approved unnecessary lake treatments totaling $15,000, and issued fines worth over $12,000 based on rules she had no authority to enforce. The criminal charges were just the beginning of Margaret's problems. The civil lawsuit I'd filed was proceeding smoothly, with my attorney confident that we'd recover substantial damages for harassment, emotional distress, and unlawful fines. Several other property owners had joined the lawsuit, creating a class action that would likely bankrupt Margaret financially. But perhaps the most satisfying part of the whole ordeal was watching Margaret's social standing in the community completely collapse. She'd built her identity around being the powerful HOA president, the woman who kept everyone in line and maintained community standards. Now she was the woman who'd been lying to her neighbors for 5 years, stealing their money, and harassing a widower who just wanted to fish in peace. Her husband, Gerald, filed for divorce 6 months after the charges were filed. Their McMansion went up for sale, but in a community where everyone knew about Margaret's fraud, finding a buyer proved difficult. The house sat empty for over a year before finally selling at a significant loss. The new HOA board, led by Tom Harrison, was everything Margaret's administration hadn't been. They were transparent, reasonable, and focused on actual community needs rather than petty power games. They also formally apologized to me for the years of harassment and officially recognized my ownership of the lake. I worked with the new board to create a reasonable lake access agreement that protected my property rights while allowing the community to continue enjoying the water. The fees were minimal, just enough to cover actual maintenance costs, and the regulations were sensible and clearly defined. No more arbitrary fines, no more unauthorized inspections, no more harassment of property owners who just wanted to enjoy their homes. The dock fees that had been illegally collected were refunded with interest, just as I'd promised. The water management contract was rebid and awarded to a legitimate company that provided better service at half the cost. And the ridiculous regulations that Margaret had imposed, like the ban on solo fishing, were immediately repealed. As for me, I finally had the peace I'd been seeking. I could fish from my dock without fear of harassment, maintain my property without arbitrary fines, and honor the memory of my father and wife without someone constantly telling me I was doing it wrong. The lake was quiet again, the way it had been when I was a child, sitting beside my father, learning to cast a line and appreciate the simple pleasure of being on the water. I still get visitors occasionally, not HOA inspectors, but neighbors who stop by to chat or fellow fishing enthusiasts who've heard about the lake. The difference is that now they ask permission, they respect my property, and they treat me like a neighbor rather than a nuisance. Margaret Whitfield learned a valuable lesson about the dangers of bullying someone who understands property law. She discovered that sometimes the quiet person who pays their fines without complaint isn't weak. They're just waiting for the right moment to remind you who really has the power. The last time I saw Margaret, she was loading boxes into a U-Haul truck, preparing to leave Lakeside Estates forever. She'd lost her position, her reputation, her marriage, and her home. All because she couldn't resist the urge to find a man for fishing alone at his own cabin. She looked up and saw me watching from my dock, coffee in hand and fishing rod beside me. For a moment, our eyes met across the water. I raised my coffee cup in a mock salute, and she quickly looked away. Within an hour, she was gone, and the lake was peaceful again. The irony wasn't lost on me. Margaret had spent 5 years trying to control every aspect of life at Lakeside Estates. But in the end, she'd been the one who was controlled by her own greed, her own need for power, and her own inability to do the basic research that would have told her she was regulating property she didn't own. I've been thinking about that day a lot lately, sitting on my dock and watching the sun set over my lake. There's something deeply satisfying about justice served, especially when it's delivered with the quiet precision of a well-researched property deed and the patience of a man who knows how to wait for the right moment. The fishing is excellent, by the way. Without Margaret's constant harassment, I've been able to enjoy the lake the way my father intended, peacefully, quietly, and without anyone asking for permission to cast a line into my own water. The baits are biting, the water is clear, and for the first time in years, Lakeside Estates feels like home again. Sometimes I wonder if Margaret ever realized the full extent of her mistake. She didn't just lose because she picked the wrong person to bully. She lost because she built her entire power structure on a foundation of lies and legal ignorance. When that foundation crumbled, everything she'd built came crashing down with it. But that's the thing about bullies who hide behind fake authority. They're only powerful until someone challenges them to prove they actually have the power they claim. Margaret spent 5 years acting like she owned the lake, but she never bothered to check if that was actually true. In the end, that oversight cost her everything. The new community is thriving under honest leadership. Property values have actually increased since Margaret's departure, partly because potential buyers no longer have to worry about arbitrary fines and harassment from a power-hungry HOA president. The lake is well-maintained, the community is peaceful, and everyone knows exactly where they stand legally. I've started a tradition of hosting an annual fishing tournament on the lake, with proceeds going to a local cancer research charity in Sarah's memory. Last year, we raised over $5,000, and the event brought the community together in a way that Margaret's authoritarian approach never could have. It turns out that when you treat people with respect and fairness, they respond with cooperation and goodwill. The best part is that I get to fish in peace, just like my father intended when he bought this property 37 years ago. No more fines, no more harassment, no more unauthorized inspections. Just me, my fishing rod, and the lake that has always been mine, finally free to enjoy it without someone constantly telling me I'm doing it wrong. Before I finish this story, I want to address something that I know some of you are thinking. You're wondering if I feel bad about what happened to Margaret, if maybe I went too far in my revenge. Let me be clear, I didn't destroy Margaret Whitfield's life. She destroyed her own life through 5 years of lies, theft, and harassment. All I did was reveal the truth about what she'd been doing and enforce my legal rights as a property owner. Margaret had countless opportunities to do the right thing. She could have researched the lake ownership before imposing regulations. She could have been honest about the fee collection instead of operating a fraudulent scheme. She could have treated me with basic human decency instead of targeting me for harassment during the most difficult period of my life. Instead, she chose to build her power on a foundation of lies and abuse. When that foundation collapsed, she had no one to blame but herself. I simply provided the truth that brought everything crashing down. The real tragedy is that none of this had to happen. If Margaret had approached me 5 years ago with a reasonable proposal for lake management, we could have worked something out. If she'd been honest about the ownership questions, we could have researched them together. If she'd shown basic empathy for a man trying to grieve in peace, we could have been allies instead of enemies. But Margaret chose conflict over cooperation, lies over truth, and power over humanity. She made those choices every day for 5 years, and eventually, those choices caught up with her. I was just the catalyst that exposed what she'd been doing all along. So here's my question for you. Have you ever dealt with someone like Margaret in your own life? Someone who abused their authority, harassed innocent people, and built their power on lies and intimidation. What did you do about it? Did you fight back? Or did you just accept the abuse and hope it would eventually stop? Let me know in the comments what you would have done in my situation. Would you have fought back immediately, or would you have done what I did and waited for the perfect moment to reveal the truth? And if you've got your own HOA horror stories, I'd love to hear them. Trust me, after 5 years of dealing with Margaret Whitfield, I've heard it all. Next week, I'm going to tell you about the time a Karen neighbor tried to steal my parking space and ended up losing her car. That's a story about patience, planning, and the beautiful moment when someone's own greed becomes their downfall. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it, because that revenge was almost as satisfying as watching Margaret load her belongings into that U-Haul truck. Until then, remember, sometimes the best revenge is simply telling the truth. And sometimes the quiet person who pays their fines without complaint is the most dangerous person in the room.